Titolo traducido 55. The farmer who talked to the rain through prayers. Emotional. A desperate farmer, after 3 years of devastating drought, kneels in tears in the arid heartland. His moving prayer to the heavens caused an inexplicable phenomenon that forever changed his community. Unwavering faith transformed dry land into living hope when everyone had already given up. A story where heaven and earth meet through the power of perseverance. Prepare for a journey of faith that will transform your heart. Like, subscribe, and comment from where you are watching this miraculous story. The dim evening light spilled over the arid countryside like golden tears from a sky that seemed as distant as hope. Amidst that vast expanse of cracked earth, knelt a man with calloused hands and a face marked by deep lines that told stories of sun and resilience. John Baker, a 42-year-old farmer, raised his eyes to the horizon as his knees sank into the dust that had once been fertile soil. Heat rose from the ground in invisible waves, but even that did not make him recoil from his position of supplication. My God, if you are still looking at this forgotten piece of land, send water. I don't ask for myself, but for these creatures who are not to blame for our stubbornness in staying, he murmured, while the dry wind carried his words away, as if even the air was too thirsty to bear the weight of a prayer. It had been 3 years and 4 months since the rain had bid farewell to that corner of the American Southwest. Not a polite farewell, with occasional drizzles of longing, but a cruel, sudden abandonment, leaving behind only the damp memory of better times. A memory that now seemed more mirage than reality, for the few who still resisted in that near ghost town. Around John's small property, fences of twisted wood demarcated hope more than the land itself. Land inherited from his father, who had received it from his grandfather. A small dynasty of stubborn men who, generation after generation, swore loyalty to that soil as one makes vows to a demanding and temperamental bride. And like every deep love relationship, this one also knew its moments of trial. Nearby, only 5 families still remained in what was once a vibrant community of almost 70 homes. The others had left, surrendering to reason that blew stronger than faith, carrying bundles of belongings and leaving behind empty houses that now served as shelter for the wind and for memories. John, however, remained, not out of foolishness as some whispered, but out of an almost mystical conviction that his mission in this life was buried in that land, waiting like a dormant seed for the awakening of the waters. Connie Baker, his 39-year-old wife, watched him from the kitchen window, her dark eyes divided between admiration for her husband's unwavering faith and growing fear for the family's survival. Her fingers drummed on the wooden windowsill as her mind calculated, for the umpteenth time that week, how much longer they could stretch the provisions that were dwindling in the pantry of the small adobe house. "Is Dad still out there talking to the sky?" asked Lucy, their 16-year-old daughter, approaching her mother with a worn notebook in her hands. Since the local school had closed, when the teacher left with the second wave of departing residents, the girl had started recording everything. In her diary, as if documenting the family's resistance was a historical duty, in the face of the oblivion that threatened to swallow them. "Yes, dear, and leave him there a little longer. Sometimes, I think those conversations of his with God and with the land are what still keep us standing," Connie replied, moving away from the window to return to the stove where a pot stubbornly tried to transform almost nothing into something that could be called dinner. In the backyard, Michael, 12, and Peter, 8, entertained themselves in a silent game, moving small improvised cars along imaginary roads in the dust. Their childhood, like the land, had been dried up by the drought, not completely dead but in a state of latency, waiting for more favorable conditions to flourish in unrestrained laughter and aimless running. Night fell quickly, as always happens, in places where the harshness of life teaches that transitions rarely come with warnings or kindness. John finally rose from the ground, his joints cracking in protest. For a moment he paused to look one last time at the horizon before turning, his back on the impassive sky. It was then that he noticed, almost imperceptible against the dark blue background that now dominated the firmament, a small cloud, no larger than a clenched fist seen from a distance, floating like a timid promise. Is the Lord really listening? To me? He whispered to himself, fearing that any words spoken aloud might scare away that tiny sign of hope. With his heart beating a little faster, he turned and walked towards the house, determined not to mention anything to the family so as not to plant expectations that might not bloom. That night was like so many others in recent years. A modest meal, conversations economical in words but rich in meaningful silences, and shared prayers around the table before each one retreated to their corner of rest. However, there was something different in the air, a kind of subtle electricity that seemed to especially involve John. Perhaps it was just the visual memory of that small cloud. Perhaps it was fatigue blurring the boundary between desire and reality. As he lay down beside Connie in the bed they had shared for 20 years, John felt the weight of the day dissolve into a sleep deeper than usual. And then, the dream came. It was not a common dream of those that fade at the first ray of sunlight. It was vivid, palpable, as if every detail was etched not in the mind, but in the very soul of the dreamer. In it, John walked through his land, but not the current land, parched and hostile. It was the land of his sweetest memories, verdant and alive. Around him, plants swayed in a dance synchronized with the gentle wind. The air carried fragrances of flowers and fruits, and the horizon pulsed in shades of green so intense that they almost hurt the eyes accustomed to the ochre monotony of the drought. In the midst of this idyllic landscape, John realized he was not alone. Beside him walked a translucent figure, made of something that looked like water in constant motion, vaguely assuming a feminine human form. There was no defined face in that liquid silhouette, but it emanated a presence as familiar as it was ancient. "Who are you?" John asked, surprised not to feel fear in the face of that unusual apparition. "You have known me forever, farmer. I am the voice you seek in the sky, although I am dormant in the earth beneath your feet," replied the figure, her voice sounding like running water over smooth stones. "I am what you call rain, but I am much more than drops falling from the sky. I am the eternal cycle, the promised return, the alliance between heaven and earth." John stopped walking, absorbing each word as dry land absorbs the first drops of a longed-for storm. "Why have you abandoned us for so long? What did we do to deserve this punishment?" The fluid figure undulated gently, as if sighing. "It is not punishment, John Baker. It is cycle. I have not abandoned you. I have only transformed myself. Sometimes, I am a constant presence. Other times, I am a necessary absence. The earth needs both periods of abundance and periods of scarcity to truly renew itself. But 3 years is too long for any renewal. People are leaving. Animals are dying. Even the most resistant plants are giving up," argued John, feeling a knot form in his throat. The figure moved closer, and John felt an inexplicable coolness emanate from her. "That is why I am here, speaking to you. Among all those who remained, you are the only one who continues to talk to me even without an apparent answer. The only one who still sees me not only as a solution to thirst, but as an ancient companion on this journey. And what can I do? I am just a stubborn man clinging to a piece of land that perhaps I should abandon, as the more sensible ones say. Your stubbornness has another name, farmer. It is called faith. Not just the faith of prayers and supplications, but the faith that manifests itself in daily work, in caring for the land even when it seems dead, in respecting the cycles that you do not fully understand but accept as part of life." The figure extended what appeared to be arms made of crystal clear water. "Your heart is the most fertile land in this heartland, John. It is in it that I will plant my first seed of return." Before John could respond, the figure dissolved into thousands of tiny droplets that did not fall to the ground, but floated around him like a liquid constellation, each drop reflecting a fragment of the world. And then, one by one, the drops began to penetrate his chest, exactly where his heart beat, each one bringing a sensation of freshness and renewal that spread throughout his body. John woke up startled, sitting up in bed in a brusque movement that awakened Connie beside him. "What is it, man? Nightmare?" she asked, her voice hoarse with sleep as her eyes tried to adjust to the dimness of the room. "No, woman. It was a good dream. Unlike anything I've ever dreamed," he replied, still feeling the echo of that peculiar freshness in his chest. "I'm going to see if the boys are covered, and I'll be right back." Connie murmured something unintelligible and turned to the other side, quickly falling back asleep. John got up and, instead of going to check on the children as he had said, went to the front door, feeling an inexplicable compulsion to look at the night sky. Upon stepping out onto the small porch, he was greeted by a sight that made his heart race. The sky, previously clear and starry as always during periods of drought, was now dotted with small clouds that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. They were not storm clouds, nor did they promise immediate rain, but their mere presence already represented an anomaly, a deviation from the relentless pattern of recent years. Unable to contain his emotion, John fell to his knees on the porch, his trembling hands covering his face as silent tears streamed through his fingers. They were not tears of relief or hope alone. They were tears of recognition, as if an old friend long lost had finally given a sign of life. "Thank you," was all he could say, his voice choked with emotion. When he finally returned to the room and lay down again, John slept the deepest and most restful sleep of recent years. And upon waking up the next morning, he made a discovery that defied any rational explanation. A small, damp circle on the packed earth floor of the porch, exactly where he had knelt the night before. As if a minimal amount of dew had condensed, only at that specific point, ignoring all the surrounding ground that remained as dry as before. John stared at that small, damp patch for long minutes, trying to process its meaning. It could be coincidence, of course. Maybe a little of the water they used to wash their hands had been spilled there, and for some reason, had not completely evaporated. Or maybe, "Dad, what are you looking at on the ground so intently?" Lucy's voice interrupted his thoughts. The girl was standing in the doorway, her inseparable notebook clutched against her chest. "Nothing, honey. Just thinking about what I need to do today," he replied, getting up quickly and forcing himself to act naturally. For some reason that he himself did not fully understand, he felt that he should keep that small manifestation to himself, at least for now. The days that followed established a strange and inexplicable pattern. Every afternoon, John knelt at the same point on the land, talking to the sky in prayers that now had less the tone of desperate supplication and more the character of an intimate dialogue. And invariably the next morning, he found small manifestations of moisture, sometimes a tiny puddle, other times just a darkened patch on the ground, occasionally even a few drops of dew on a specific plant that all the others around did not present. It was never enough water for any practical use, much less to irrigate crops or quench the thirst of animals. But it was regular, persistent, and above all, inexplicable in a region where humidity had become an almost mythological phenomenon. Lucy, with her teenage curiosity sharpened by boredom and isolation, began to notice her father's increasingly peculiar behavior. The long periods he spent kneeling in the same spot on the land, the morning visits to that same place, the different gleam in his eyes when he returned from these inspections. Initially worried that the harshness of life might be affecting her father's sanity, the girl began to record her observations in detail in her diary. April 10th. Dad stayed kneeling on the land for 47 minutes today, staring fixedly at the sky and moving his lips as if talking to someone. When he came home, he seemed different. Not exactly happy, but with a kind of peace it's hard to explain. I'm worried, but at the same time, this is the dad who is most like the dad before the drought I've seen in recent years. April 11th. I followed Dad very early when he thought no one had woken up yet. He went straight to the same spot where he always prays and stood looking at the ground for several minutes. I couldn't see what was so interesting there, but when he left, I went to check. The ground was damp, as if someone had spilled water, but it didn't rain, and no one would waste water in these hard times. Gradually, Lucy's records became more detailed and began to include not only observations about her father, but also small changes in the environment around that specific point on the land. a weed that sprouted where nothing had grown for years, a small colony of ants that settled nearby, as if they knew something that humans ignored, the occasional singing of birds that had long abandoned the region. Meanwhile, in the small village that was struggling against extinction, rumors began to circulate. At first they were just whispers between neighbors, casual observations about how the baker's property seemed less affected by the merciless intensity of the sun. Then came speculations about John's long prayers, which some had already noticed from afar. In a community struck by misfortune and hungry for any sign of hope, it was not long before the figure of the farmer began to be enveloped in an almost mystical aura. Sebastian Cordero, one of the closest neighbors, was the first to muster the courage to address the matter directly. One Sunday afternoon, he appeared at the baker's property bringing a small bag of corn seeds, a precious gift in times where each grain was counted with the care of someone handling gold. "I brought these for you to keep, John," he said, extending the small bundle with a mixture of shyness and hope in his eyes. "They say in the village that your land will be the first to see water again. I want these seeds to be here when that day comes." John stared at his neighbor with an expression difficult to decipher, then looked at the bag of seeds as if assessing not its weight but its significance. "Who's been saying these things, Sebastian?" he finally asked, his voice neutral, neither confirming nor denying the rumors. "Everyone and no one, you know how it is," replied the man, slightly averting his gaze. "People notice things. They comment. And in these difficult times, any sign of change becomes a topic." John nodded slowly, finally accepting the gift. "Thank you for your trust. God willing, we will plant them together when the rain returns." In the days that followed, other neighbors appeared, each bringing small offerings, saved seeds, resistant seedlings kept alive with difficulty, and even minuscule portions of water collected from distant sources. No one directly mentioned the rumors about John being a rain communicator, as some were already calling him in whispers. But each gift was delivered with a look loaded with expectation and faith. Connie watched this unusual movement with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, she felt touched by the trust that the community placed in her husband, and pleased with the small renewal of social bonds that the drought had frayed. On the other, she feared that all this buzz might be fueling hopes impossible to satisfy, both in people and in John himself. At night, when they were finally alone, she tried to broach the subject with caution. "John, these people are placing too much faith in you. I'm worried that this could become too heavy a burden," she said, while braiding her hair for sleep, a ritual she maintained faithfully despite the adverse circumstances, like a small act of preserved dignity. John, sitting on the edge of the bed, looked at his own hands with a contemplative expression. "I don't ask them to believe in me, Connie. I never told anyone I can make it rain. But you also didn't deny the rumors," she pointed out gently. "And these strange things that have been happening. The damp circles, the plants sprouting where nothing grew. You never explained that to me properly." John raised his eyes to meet his wife's gaze, and Connie saw something there that deeply disconcerted her. Not the unwavering determination she had always known, nor the sad resignation of recent years, but a luminous serenity, almost alien in a face so marked by suffering. "I haven't explained because I don't know how to explain, woman. I just know that something changed since that dream. It's like I've rediscovered an old friendship that I thought was lost forever." "A dream?" Connie frowned. "What dream is this that you never told me about?" And so, for the first time, John recounted in detail the dream of the figure made of water, the feeling of communion with something much greater than himself, and the promise of a return that would come not as a sudden explosion of abundance, but as a gradual awakening of the dormant land. Connie listened to everything in silence, her face going through a succession of expressions, initially skeptical, then perplexed, finally surrendering to a possibility that defied any practical logic, but that spoke directly to the oldest and most intuitive part of her soul. "Do you think I'm going crazy?" John asked when he finished his account, his voice betraying a rare vulnerability. Connie approached and took her husband's hands in hers. "No, my dear. I think you are listening to something the rest of us have forgotten how to hear." However, despite this apparent acceptance, Connie could not completely abandon her practical concerns. While John seemed increasingly immersed in his mysterious connection with the elements, she continued to secretly plan a possible exit. Occasional letters were exchanged with her sister in the big city. Careful arrangements were made, always with the silent justification that she needed to ensure a plan B for her children, in case the promise whispered by the wind did not materialize. 2 months passed in this precarious balance between faith and pragmatism. The small manifestations of moisture on the baker's property continued, now observed not only by the family, but also by neighbors who occasionally appeared to visit and ended up directing hopeful glances at the piece of land where John offered his prayers. The news had spread beyond the limits of the small village, attracting sporadic visitors from neighboring communities, some moved by curiosity, others by the hopelessness that seeks any thread of possibility to cling to. It was in this context that a dusty car, visibly exhausted by the journey on precarious roads, parked at the entrance of the village one particularly hot afternoon. From it descended a man of approximately 50 years, thin-rimmed glasses, practical but evidently urban clothes, carrying a backpack that seemed too heavy for his slender physique. The stranger went to the only general store still operating in the place, where Mr. Manuel, owner and self-proclaimed guardian of local memories, spent his days between serving the rare customers and lamenting the lost glory days of the village. "Good afternoon," greeted the stranger, taking a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the sweat that flowed freely down his face. "I'm looking for information about a rural property. It belongs to a man named John Baker." Mr. Manuel studied the stranger with a distrustful gaze that rural inhabitants usually reserve for unexpected visitors, especially those who arrive asking specific questions. "And what does a city man want with John?" he retorted, leaning on the worn wooden counter with a casualness that barely disguised his protective posture. The man smiled, seeming to already expect such a reception. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Dr. Ricardo Menezes, a meteorologist from the State University. I am in the region studying the phenomenon of prolonged drought and its impacts," he explained, extending his hand, which Mr. Manuel accepted after a moment of hesitation. "And what does that have to do with John?" "Well, I've heard unusual stories about his property. Inexplicable manifestations of moisture, plants sprouting out of season, that kind of thing," replied the scientist, maintaining a carefully neutral tone, neither skeptical nor credulous. Mr. Manuel's face took on an expression difficult to interpret, a mixture of local pride and instinctive protectiveness. "They're just stories," he finally said, averting his gaze to a nearly empty shelf behind him. "You know how people are in hard times. Any green leaf becomes a miracle." Dr. Ricardo nodded patiently. "I understand perfectly. But even so, I would like to meet Mr. Baker. Purely for academic research purposes, of course. We are collecting testimonials about how families are coping with the drought." Realizing that the stranger would not be easily dissuaded, Mr. Manuel finally provided directions to the Baker's property, not without adding a veiled warning. "John is a simple man, Doctor. Respected by everyone here. Whatever your research is, I hope you remember that." The meteorologist thanked him for the information and, after purchasing a bottle of water, at prices that reflected its scarcity, returned to his car and followed in the indicated direction. Dr. Ricardo's arrival at the Baker's property coincided with one of those daily moments when John knelt at his usual prayer spot. From inside the car, the scientist observed the scene with professional interest. A man visibly worn down by material, difficulties but emanating a kind of serene dignity, in silent communication with the relentlessly blue sky above. Upon noticing the approach of the vehicle, John slowly rose and walked towards the unexpected visitor. His face showed neither surprise nor suspicion, only a quiet curiosity, as if the arrival of strangers was just another natural unfolding in a sequence of extraordinary events. "Good afternoon," greeted Dr. Ricardo, getting out of the car and immediately feeling the impact of the intense heat. "Mr. John Baker?" "That's me," confirmed the farmer, extending his calloused hand, which contrasted vividly with that of the academic. "How can I help you?" After initial introductions and a summarized explanation about his research work in the region, Dr. Ricardo was invited into the simple but impeccably organized house, where Connie received him with the characteristic hospitality of the rural folk, offering freshly brewed coffee and the protocol apologies for the simplicity of the home, which the visitor dismissed with sincere kindness. It was Lucy who first noticed something peculiar in the scientist's behavior. While the adults talked about general topics, the impact of the drought, insufficient government policies, the survival strategies of the families who resisted, the teenager realized that the man's gaze frequently drifted to the windows, as if looking for something outside the house. "You seem very interested in our backyard, Doctor," she finally observed, interrupting the conversation with the typical frankness of youth. Dr. Ricardo smiled, somewhat disconcerted at being caught. "Sharp, your girl," he commented to John and Connie, before turning to Lucy. "Actually, I'm curious about something specific I heard about your property. They say there are unusual manifestations of moisture in certain spots of the land. Is that true?" A heavy silence settled in the small room. John and Connie exchanged meaningful glances, while Lucy narrowed her eyes with sudden distrust. "Did you come here to laugh at our misfortune or at our hope?" asked the girl directly, ignoring her mother's disapproving look. "Lucy," Connie rebuked, but Dr. Ricardo raised his hand in a pacifying gesture. "It's a fair question," he said, turning to the teenager. "I didn't come to laugh at anything, girl. I came because I am a scientist, and scientists are interested in things they cannot easily explain." He shifted his gaze to John. "And I confess that I am intrigued by the stories I have heard. I traveled all the way here because if there is something truly inexplicable happening, however small it may be, it could have importance not only for my research, but for the entire region." John studied the stranger's face for long moments, as if looking for signs of mockery or falsehood in it. Finally, he nodded almost imperceptibly and stood up. "Come with me, Doctor. I'll show you what's been happening." The two men went out to the land under the relentless afternoon sun, followed at a discreet distance by Connie and the children, who did not want to miss a single detail of that unusual encounter between the ancestral knowledge of their father and the science represented by the visitor. John guided Dr. Ricardo to the specific point where he offered his daily prayers, now marked by a slightly different coloration of the earth around it. Not exactly damp, but with a darker and more alive hue. "This is where I kneel every afternoon, to talk to the sky," he explained simply, without elaborating on the nature of these conversations or mentioning the dream that had changed everything. "And this is where, every morning, I find signs of moisture. Sometimes a small puddle, sometimes just damp earth, as if there was dew only in this circle." Dr. Ricardo crouched down, examining the soil with genuine interest. From his backpack, he took out instruments that the family had never seen. A small device that measured the surface temperature, another that analyzed the relative humidity of the air, and a third that collected soil samples for later analysis. "Incredible," he murmured, more to himself than to others after taking some preliminary measurements. "The soil temperature at this specific point is approximately 3 degrees lower than in the surrounding areas. And the relative humidity of the air. This makes no sense at all." "What doesn't make sense, Doctor?" asked Michael, who had approached closer, his childish curiosity overcoming his initial shyness. Dr. Ricardo raised his eyes to the boy, then looked at the whole family gathered, realizing the weight of responsibility of his words at that moment. "It's as if there's a completely different microclimate exactly at this point," he explained, trying to simplify complex concepts. "A bubble of atmospheric conditions that defy the pattern of the region. It's like an island of humidity in an ocean of dryness." "Is that good or bad?" questioned Peter, the youngest, making everyone smile briefly at the direct simplicity of the question. "It's extraordinary," replied the scientist, standing up and looking at John with a renewed expression of respect. "Mr. Baker, I would like to install some continuous measurement equipment at this location, if you allow it. Sensors that would record the climatic conditions over time, sending data to our computers at the university. This would help us understand what is happening here. And how would that help bring the rain back? Asked Lucy, still maintaining her protective posture towards her family. Dr. Ricardo smiled, appreciating the young woman's perspicacity. Science rarely offers immediate answers, girl, but understanding unusual climatic phenomena can lead us to important insights about the larger patterns that affect the entire region. If we can understand why this specific piece of land maintains different characteristics from its surroundings, perhaps we can extrapolate this knowledge to broader applications. The explanation sounded honest, but still left a feeling of incompleteness in the air. There were more questions than answers, more mystery than clarity. However, for a family that had already lived for years at the confluence between faith and despair, any new direction seemed worthy of consideration. You can install your devices, Doctor, John finally agreed, but with one condition. I want to know everything you discover, not just the technical terms and scientific explanations, but what it really means for our land and our people. Dr. Ricardo extended his hand, sealing the agreement with a firm handshake. It's a commitment, Mr. Baker. Science without translation for real life is just an exercise in intellectual vanity. In the days that followed, the Bakers' property transformed into a small open-air laboratory. Sophisticated equipment was installed not only at John's specific prayer point, but also in various locations around it for comparison purposes. Dr. Ricardo, initially planning to stay only 2 days, ended up extending his stay at the small village inn, fascinated by the inexplicable readings that his instruments captured. What began as a visit motivated by scientific curiosity turned into a serious study that soon attracted the attention of the academic community. 2 weeks after the installation of the equipment, 2 more researchers arrived in the region, bringing even more advanced instruments and an avalanche of technical terminologies that left the locals simultaneously impressed and confused. They speak difficult but don't know how to explain the simple, commented Mr. Manuel one afternoon, while a group of residents gathered at the general store to discuss the news. All this apparatus and they still can't say when the rain will return. But at least now they believe that something really is happening, argued Sebastian Cordero. It's no longer just imagination of desperate rural folk, as the government technicians who came here at the beginning of the drought used to say. While the community debated the meanings and implications of the research, the presence of the scientists ended up generating an unexpected side effect: media attention. A reporter from a regional newspaper, sniffing out an unusual story, appeared without prior warning and soon transformed the inexplicable meteorological phenomenon into a sensationalist headline. Farmer talks to the rain, miracle or climatic anomaly. The report, although full of inaccuracies and exaggerations, spread rapidly through communication channels, eventually reaching larger outlets. In a matter of days, the Bakers' property ceased to be just an object of scientific study to become a point of pilgrimage. People from neighboring communities, equally affected by the drought, began to appear in increasing numbers, some bringing empty bottles hoping to collect some of the miraculous water, others simply wanting to touch the soil where the miracle was happening. John watched this movement with a mixture of perplexity and discomfort. He had never sought attention or proclaimed any special ability. He was just a man who refused to give up on his land, and who, by a quirk of fate or by a mystical connection that even he did not fully understand, had found a way of communication with something greater than himself. "This is turning into a fair, John," commented Connie one morning, watching from the window a new group of visitors approaching. "Soon they'll want you to charge for miracles, like those healers from the big city." "I never promised miracles to anyone," he replied, his voice laden with weariness. "I just wanted to take care of our land and bring water to our family." "I know, my dear, but people need to believe in something. And it's easier to believe in a man they can see and touch than in invisible forces that seem to have abandoned them." The situation reached a new level when, 6 months after the installation of the first measurement equipment, Dr. Ricardo returned from one of his periodic trips to the university bringing surprising news. Satellite images had detected a peculiar pattern of cloud formation over the area encompassing the Baker's property and surroundings. "It's not just the instruments in the ground, Mr. Baker," explained the scientist, extending printed photographs that showed white spots, contrasting with the prevailing blue. "There is a constant formation of humidity in the atmosphere above, your property that defies all known meteorological models. It's as if something is reorganizing the water molecules in the air, creating a pattern that experts describe as mathematically impossible to occur naturally." "What does this mean in practical terms, Doctor?" asked John, looking at the images with more confusion than understanding. Dr. Ricardo took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something he knew would be poorly received. "It means that this phenomenon has crossed the borders of regional scientific curiosity. The international academic community is interested. And unfortunately, it also means that commercial interests are eyeing what is happening here." The scientist's prediction came true faster than anyone could imagine. Less than 2 weeks after this conversation, a convoy of luxury cars parked at the entrance of the Baker's property. From them descended men in suits, despite the relentless heat, carrying briefcases and expressions that tried to seem friendly, but could not entirely hide the calculating eagerness in their eyes. "Mr. Baker," approached the apparent leader of the group, a man in his 50s with impeccably combed gray hair. "Carlos Mendonça, Innovation Director of AgroFuture. I would like to talk about a proposal that could transform not only your life, but this entire region." Thus began what Lucy would later describe in her diary as the siege of the vultures in suits. AgroFuture, one of the largest agribusiness corporations in the country, had developed a sudden interest in the Baker phenomenon, as it was already called in business circles. The initial proposal seemed tempting. Buy all the land around John's property for values well above market price, build a state-of-the-art meteorological research center, and hire John himself as a special consultant to scientifically study his apparent ability to influence local climate conditions. "Imagine, Mr. Baker," argued Carlos Mendonça, sitting in the family's simple living room as if he were in a corporate meeting room. "If we can understand and eventually replicate what happens naturally on your property, we could develop technologies capable of mitigating the effects of droughts throughout the semi-arid region. It would be a revolution for the American Southwest." John listened to everything in silence, his face impassive as the surface of a lake on a windless day. Beside him, Connie wrung her hands tightly, divided between the dazzle of the values mentioned and the instinctive distrust of promises too big to fit into her known reality. "And what would happen to our neighbors?" John finally asked. "To the community that has resisted all these years?" Carlos Mendonça smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "They would be generously compensated for their properties, Mr. Baker. They could start over in places with better infrastructure, schools, for the children, adequate hospitals. Isn't that what everyone wants? A better life?" "A different life is not necessarily a better life, Mr. Mendonça," replied John, slowly standing up as if ending an audience. "I need time to think about your proposal and to talk to my family and my neighbors." Of course," agreed the businessman, also standing up and extending a business card printed on fine paper that seemed out of place in that environment. "Take your time, but remember that opportunities like this rarely knock twice." After the executives left, a dense silence settled in the Baker's house. It was Lucy who finally broke it, her voice trembling slightly between indignation and fear. "They want to turn what's happening here into a business, don't they? They want to package and sell what we don't even understand properly." John nodded heavily, still looking at the business card in his calloused hand. "That's what it seems like, honey." "And you're considering their proposal?" asked the teenager, her eyes fixed on her father as if trying to see through him. "I'm considering all possibilities," replied John after a moment, "including what could happen if we refuse." The news of AgroFuture's visit and their proposal spread through the village like wildfire. In a matter of hours, the community divided into two passionate factions: those who saw the proposal as an economic lifeline for families who for years had survived on the thin line of subsistence, and those who feared that the corporation was only interested in exploiting the phenomenon for its own profit, without real concerns for local well-being in the long term. Surprisingly, it was Connie who emerged as the strongest voice against the corporate proposal. The same woman who, months before, secretly planned the family's escape to the big city, now organized meetings with neighbors in her kitchen, articulating arguments against the sale of the properties. "They don't want to help the heartland," she said with an eloquence that surprised even those who had known her for decades. "They want to patent the rain. They want a fence in the sky with barbed wire and charge admission. And when the show is over, when they have sucked up every last drop of knowledge or mystery of what happens here, they will leave, leaving behind only empty promises and contracts full of fine print." While the community seethed with debate, Lucy continued her meticulous observations, now with a renewed focus. Reviewing her records from recent months, the young woman began to notice a pattern that had escaped even the scientists with their sophisticated instruments. The small manifestations of moisture always coincided not only with her father's prayers, but specifically with moments when he showed genuine concern for collective well-being. There was never a response when he asked for benefits only for himself or his family. "It's like whatever is causing this only responds to true altruism," she concluded, writing in trembling letters of excitement in her diary. "It's not about technique or method or some special gift. It's about intention, about connection." Meanwhile, the pressure from Agro-Future intensified. Company representatives began to negotiate individually with neighbors, offering increasing values for their properties and painting seductive scenarios of a prosperous future, away from that arid reality. One by one, the most die-hard resistors began to yield, justifying to themselves and to others that perhaps this really was a unique opportunity to escape the cycle of poverty that had trapped generations. The tension reached a new level when, 3 weeks after the initial proposal, tractors and heavy machinery began to arrive in the region. Under the guise of preliminary soil studies, the company began work on the properties already acquired, creating an environment of inevitability that further undermined the resistance of the few who had not yet sold their land. It was in this climate of veiled harassment and forced decisions that something extraordinary happened. After almost 4 years of merciless absence, heavy dark clouds began to form on the horizon. Not the small isolated formations that occasionally appeared over the baker's property, but a compact and threatening mass that promised significant precipitation. At first, the news was received with unrestrained celebration. People came out of their houses to look at the sky, some falling to their knees in gratitude, others hugging each other in tears of relief. After so long of suffering, nature finally seemed to offer a truce, a chance to start over. Dr. Ricardo, however, showed concern as he analyzed his instruments and repeatedly checked the data received from the satellites. "This is not right," he murmured, shaking his head negatively as he compared readings. "The formation is too fast, too intense. The soil is not prepared to receive so much water at once." His somber prediction began to materialize when the first fat drops finally fell, quickly followed by a deluge of biblical proportions. The parched land, unable to absorb such a quantity of water in such a short time, transformed into runoff channels for violent torrents that dragged everything in their path. In a matter of hours, the celebration turned into panic. Houses with foundations weakened by years of drought began to show dangerous cracks. Small animals, painstakingly maintained during the drought, were swept away by the current. Agro-Futures. Tractors parked on low ground began to sink into the mud that formed rapidly. In the midst of this chaos, John Baker made a decision that would forever change not only his life, but the destiny of the entire community. Ignoring Connie's desperate pleas for him to stay safe, the farmer went out into the relentless storm, heading to the highest point of his property, a small elevation that locals called Watch Hill, for offering a privileged view of the entire region. Soaked to the bone, lashed by winds that seemed to want to tear the very skin off him, John knelt in the earth now transformed into mud, and for the first time in all those months, did not ask. He did not plead. He did not negotiate. He simply talked, as if he were facing an old friend with whom he had lost contact for too long. "Thank you for visiting," he said, his voice almost inaudible under the roar of the storm. "I know you miss this soil as much as it misses you. But just like us, the land also needs time to get used to your presence again. We need balance, not extremes. We need the dance, not the war." Witnesses who took shelter near the site, including Dr. Ricardo and some of his scientist colleagues, later reported something that their instruments recorded, but their rational minds were reluctant to accept. The clouds above John seemed to reorganize in real time, as if responding directly to his words. The rain, previously torrential and destructive, gradually transformed into a constant and gentle drizzle that continued for days, allowing the land to absorb the moisture gradually, without the trauma of sudden floods. In the weeks that followed, the heartland around slowly awakened from its long, arid sleep. It was not an instantaneous transformation into a verdant paradise, as in miracle stories, but a process of gradual and resilient recovery. Small pioneer plants emerged in places previously dominated only by stone and dust. The level of the few wells in the region rose steadily but controllably. Birds long absent returned, bringing music to a scenario previously dominated only by silence and wind. Agrofuture, confronted with a reality that defied its meticulously calculated plans and increasing public pressure after reports about its aggressive land acquisition methods, retreated strategically. It did not completely abandon its interest in the region, but redirected its approach, offering partnerships instead of purchases, collaboration instead of appropriation. Dr. Ricardo and his team expanded their research, transforming the phenomenon, initially located on the Baker's property, into a broad study on microclimates and the recovery of degraded areas. Scientists from various parts of the world visited the region, contributing with varied perspectives and methodologies, but all left with more questions than definitive answers about the exact nature of what had happened there. John, remaining true to his humble and pragmatic nature, refused to be treated as a messianic figure or scientific celebrity. He transformed his property into a community center for permaculture, where ancestral cultivation practices were combined with modern environmental preservation techniques. His knowledge, or his connection, as he preferred to call it, was never fully understood by science, but became a vital part of the cultural identity of the region. Lucy continued her diligent records, eventually turning them into a book that combined meteorological observations with philosophical reflections on the relationship between humanity and nature. Her unique perspective, merging the scientific rigor learned with Dr. Ricardo and the intuitive wisdom inherited from her parents, offered a bridge between worlds that many considered irreconcilable. Connie, who one day secretly planned the family's escape, became the fierce guardian of local traditions and encourager of the young people's permanence. "Our roots are as important as our wings," she used to say at community meetings that she now organized regularly under the shade of trees that were returning to bloom. And what about the secret of John's communication with the rain? It was never completely revealed or explained in terms that equally satisfied scientific minds and mystical hearts. Perhaps it was a special gift, perhaps an extraordinary sensitivity to atmospheric patterns, perhaps a manifestation of ancestral knowledge that modern civilization had forgotten or discarded. What remained unquestionable was its impact, not only on the ecological recovery of the region, but on the renewal of a form of relationship with nature based on mutual respect and balance. Years later, when visitors asked John about his power or technique, he simply smiled and replied with the quiet wisdom of those who have lived intensely. The rain was always willing to talk. We were the ones who had forgotten how to listen. And so, in a small corner of the American Southwest, an extraordinary story of resilience, faith, and connection with forces greater than human understanding continued to inspire generations, reminding everyone that, even in the most arid times, hope can sprout from the most unlikely soil, as long as it is cultivated with patience, respect, and true love for the land that sustains us. and for the sky that covers us with its eternal promises of renewal, of relationship with nature based on mutual respect and balance. Years later, when visitors asked John about his power or technique, he simply smiled and replied with the quiet wisdom of those who had lived intensely. The rain was always willing to talk. We were the ones who had forgotten how to listen. And so, in a small corner of the Brazilian outback, an extraordinary story of resilience, faith, and connection with forces greater than human understanding continued to inspire generations, reminding everyone that, even in the most arid times, hope can sprout from the most unlikely soil, as long as it is cultivated with patience, respect, and true love for the land that sustains us, and for the sky that covers us with its eternal promises of renewal.